Today's reading comes from 1 Peter 3, 8 through 18. Finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil, and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. For it is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. 1 Peter 3, 8 through 18, the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Amen. You may be seated, everyone. Hey, good morning. Welcome to Hope. My name is Drew. I'm one of the pastors here. And today is actually a standalone message. Next week, we actually begin a message series in the season of Lent. But today, we actually will be revisiting a theme that we talked about at last week's Young Adult Retreat. Now, just a quick show of hands. How many of you were at the Young Adult Retreat last week? Yes. All right. We talked about this theme of good news people. Now, this phrase, good news people, or this idea of good news, it actually comes from the scriptures. And we're going to talk about where that news comes from, or where that word or that phrasing comes from, and how in many ways the Christian story was something that was supposed to upend the ways, especially in the ancient world, people understood what good news was all about. And so in the passage that was just read for us, it really hints at this idea of what does it mean for us to be good news people. Now, check out what it says, or actually check out this word, because this word really in the ancient Greek is where we get this phrase good news from. It's called evangelion. Can I hear you say evangelion? That's right. It comes from these two compound words, basically meaning good and then news or message. So it literally means good news or message. Now, here's the thing. In the historical context, in the ancient world, this idea of good news, whenever they would say, evangelion, evangelion, the good news that they were talking about, especially in ancient Rome, was whenever the emperor of Rome, whenever they were celebrating a conquest in Rome, so Caesar Augustus would win and expand his kingdom with military might and conquest. And they would have a parade celebrating the fact that Rome, with its military strength and power, was expanding its territory. So then they would say, evangelion, evangelion. So it was, in other words, it was this idea that good news was being brought about for the people of Rome through conquest and military might. Now, so this is what's so stunning, right? Because some of you are like, oh, well, is that what Christianity is about? Well, absolutely not. Because here Jesus was as an oppressed people group. He is a Jewish person who's a carpenter from Nazareth with no military strength, no might, no powerful equity in the world. And yet somehow the people of God that would end up following Jesus, they would start proclaiming evangelion, evangelion, good news, good news. So you can imagine the listener or the reader they're leaning in. They're like, what? What? Military conquest? And they're like, no. There's another kind of kingdom, good news of a different kind of kingdom that's entered into the world. It's different than military might and strength. It's actually a kingdom that is supposed to be good and comes through love and forgiveness and justice and mercy. I mean, could you imagine? The Christians are taking this word then, and they're flipping the meaning of it to be like, no, this is really a good kind of news for me and for you. So check this out. Look at what Paul writes to his letter to the church in Rome. He says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel. Now that word gospel is the word evangelion. For I'm not ashamed of the good news. Why? Because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. Now, isn't this stunning? Paul is writing this to Rome. And he's basically saying, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Could you imagine the listeners like, oh, gospel, like you're not ashamed of Caesar Augustus conquering these other pitiful little areas around us? And it's no. It's a different kind of gospel. A gospel that brings salvation, a saving of the soul and the body, a way of approaching life that is so different than the world around us. Now, this word, evangelion, you might even hear that word and be like, oh, that sounds a lot like today. Many people use this word evangel or evangelical. And some of you are like, oh, that's what that word means. It means that we're to be a people who actually bear good news. Some of you perhaps, maybe you're not a Christian here, and you've heard this word before, or you've heard the word evangelism. Evangelism actually comes from this word in the Greek, evangelizo, which basically is the verb form of good news. In other words, it's proclaiming good news. To proclaim good news then is what evangelism is. Now, some of us, we recoil because we're like, I don't know what evangelicals are known for in the world today, political power, all these ways in which this word has been co-opted in today's culture. And some of us, maybe you're not a Christian here and you're like, oh my goodness, these religious evangelicals. Well, all this word means for evangel or evangelical or evangelism is that hopefully we're a people that bring good news. Not bad news, but so much of the church today is known for being bearers of bad news or judgment or condemnation. But see, the early Christians, they were constantly a people that were bringing good news. I was just talking to someone earlier today about how we're doing some premarital counseling, and they were sharing with me about how their mom is just, this spirit that she brings is like a spirit of joy wherever she goes. She just enters the room, she just enlivens the place. And I was just thinking, that's a good news person. Someone who comes and like, their very presence, like who they are is like good news. It's great to be around them. And in many ways, that's what the idea of a good news was supposed to be about, was to be someone who's bearing something, a positivity, a kind of salvation, a kind of goodness and joy. Now, evangelizo, if it means to proclaim good news, evangelism is proclaiming that very good news. But it's not only about the news that we proclaim, though. Because check this out. The early church, you got to understand, the early church, they were this persecuted minority. And yet, whenever they preached this good news, there was also a certain way in which the early Christians were taught about how were we going to share this good news. Check this out. And in the passage that was just read for us, look at what the Apostle Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. He says, but in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope you have. Do you see what Peter is basically saying? He's saying, listen, at all times, be ready to share about this good news. But notice what he says. But do this with judgmentalism and harshness. No, he doesn't say that. He says, but do this with gentleness and respect. High five your neighbor and say gentleness and respect. Yes. If you're sitting with your spouse, you know what I'm talking about. Gentleness and respect. Now, this is what Peter's saying. He's saying, yes, the good news, it is good news, and we're to proclaim this good news. But actually, the way that we're supposed to share this good news, the way that people experience us as people of faith. Now, keep in mind, Peter is writing this to the persecuted church in Asia Minor. So could you imagine? He's basically saying to them, and even in the passage that was read for us earlier, he's basically saying, hey, listen, I want you to suffer for doing good. I want you to respond to evil and pain with forgiveness and love. I want you to do so with gentleness and respect. Could you imagine? This is a persecuted minority already. And he's talking about showing up in the world with a certain kind of goodness, a certain kind of love and kindness and gentleness and respect. See, but it's not only Apostle Peter. Check out what Paul writes to the church in Colossae. Look what he writes in Colossians chapter 4. Paul writes, be wise. High five your neighbor, say be wise. That's right. In the way you act toward outsiders, in other words, those outside the church. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace. High five your neighbor, say full of grace. That's right. Full of grace, seasoned with salt. High five your neighbor, say seasoned with salt. Some of you are like, are we going to keep doing this? So that you may know how to answer everyone. Now, isn't this interesting? See, now Paul is writing, and very much in the same tenor that Peter writes about. Because Peter's talking about gentleness and respect, and here Paul is. He's like, hey, listen, this is the way that we show up in the world. Yes, people may persecute you. Yes, people may be mean. People might have different views than you. People might be harsh. People might be persecuting you and even wanting you to die. But this is how I want you to respond. I want you to be full of grace. Your conversation seasoned with salt. That you're wise in the way that you approach other people. Now, isn't this stunning? Because it's not only about the good news here. See, what does it mean for us to be good news people? Especially in a world that we live in today. Now, check out this graph. This graph is from a recent study by Lifeway Research. And Lifeway Research has actually shown that the trust that the general public in the United States has for church and organized religion, it continues to decrease. People are more and more skeptical and angry and mistrusting of the church and of religious leaders. I'm sorry. I mean, this is basically the way that in today's world, Christians are not known as being a people who respond with gentleness and respect, with grace, and having our conversations seasoned with salt. In fact, mistrust is at an all-time high for churches as well as for organizations. Now, some of you are like, that's it, I'm leaving. Well, hold on. I often say to people, I'm like, listen, I know you may not trust organized religion, but we're not that organized here at Hope. So, Christina is, though. She's our assistant. Yes, Dave, of course, all these people, yes, they're organized. But I often tell people, like, listen, I often, when people ask me, what do you do? I'm like, I work in kind of like social services a little bit. Oh, like what? Oh, like, just helping kind of the needs of the city. Oh, like what exactly do you do? All right, I'm a pastor, okay? Just leave me alone. Because I know that the reputation of churches, especially in a secular society like New York, can easily be condemning towards Christians. And why? Because our reputation has often been that we are not a people of gentleness and respect, seasoned with salt, and gracious to other people. And yet the invitation, what the early Christians knew, even amidst being a persecuted minority, was that, what did it mean to be good news people? It means that we're a people, hopefully. We proclaim good news, but we proclaim good news in a good way. High five your neighbor and say, proclaim good news in a good way. Isn't that interesting? So many times Christians have become known for maybe preaching good news, but it feels like bad news, or it's done in a bad way. And yet the invitation that the early Christians knew, that what it meant to be a good news people, is that we show up in the world and we proclaim the good news in a good way. Now, Pete Scazzaro, who's one of my mentors, who's the founder of Emotionally Healthy Discipleship, he has this phrase that he says. He says, what you do matters. I mean, isn't that true? Especially in the world that we live in. What you do matters, but who you are matters more. Now, why does he say that? He's talking about the way that good news people show up, hopefully, is that, yes, we proclaim good news. We believe in this incredible good news of who Jesus is, but we do so, hopefully, in a good way. What you do matters, who you are matters more. High five your neighbor and say, what you do matters, who you are matters more. Now, I realize some of you are like, if you're new here, you're like, I'm never coming to this church again. Who you are matters more. One of our core courses that we teach here and that we constantly are encouraging every single person in our church to go through, it's called Emotionally Healthy Discipleship. Now, the reason we encourage people to go through Emotionally Healthy Discipleship is because it's at the core of shaping who we are. That what it means to follow Jesus, these courses get into areas of our lives that is more than simply, hey, just memorize these doctrines or these verses or try to practice these kinds of practices. It's actually an invitation to allow God into the deepest parts of who we are, into our defensiveness, into our pain, into our sadness, into our trauma, into our ways of living that simply echo the similar ways of secular society. And when we talk about emotionally healthy discipleship, we're saying every part of who we are then is hopefully being shaped and shaping the culture of our church community. Now, I recognize we talk about this so often, and in full disclosure, I'm the executive director of emotionally healthy discipleship, this global ministry. So like some of you are like, oh, you're just saying this. And listen, I tell people, I'm like, listen, let me tell you why I'm the executive director of emotionally healthy discipleship. It's because of how emotionally unhealthy I am. Like if you knew the workaholic background that I came from, if you knew some of the pain and trauma from my past that I need healing from, if you knew all the ways in which my insecurities drive me more than hearing from the voice of God, this is why I need this so desperately. But this is why we want to encourage all of us to be on this journey. Why? Because what you do matters, but who you are matters more. And the reason there's this image of an iceberg is because an iceberg, 90% is below the surface. And when we talk about following Jesus, we're not talking about following Jesus in this perfunctory way. We're talking about following Jesus. So the deepest parts of you, the parts that might be hidden, the shame, the sin, the fears, the anxieties, the weakness, the sadness, that every part of you, that we can bring this before God and we say, God, please, can you bring healing to the deepest parts of my life? Now, here's an overview of what these courses cover. And you can see we talk about emotionally unhealthy spirituality in part 1. We talk about knowing yourself so that you might know God. We talk about breaking free from patterns of the past. We've been more shaped by the echoes of generations of our families that have told us what success is or what money looks like or how do we use our bodies and how we do relationships. We talk about grief and loss and how those things are supposed to shape us, hopefully, to be more Godward. We talk about confronting different walls in our lives and beginning to practice new habits of silence, solitude, Sabbath keeping, and getting rhythms where God becomes the central person in our lives and growing into emotional maturity, as well as crafting a rule of life, centering our lives on who God is. Now, part 2, if you notice, part 2 has a number of different relationship skills. It's not just for people who are in romantic relationships. It's for anyone who has any kind of relationship, which means all of us. It means in our workplaces, how do we show up? How do we become a people who practice new skills of relating to one another, of being a people of blessing, saying kind words versus saying harsh and cursing words? Like, isn't that something that New York City needs? How do we become a people who begin to listen well to other people? How do we become a people who can actually navigate conflict in ways in which who we are matters more? Now, notice, in both of these courses, we basically are inviting people into a deeper way of showing up. What you do matters, but who you are matters more. That as good news people, how do we become a people who proclaim the good news in a good way? That when people experience us, they experience us as people of gentleness and respect, people seasoned with salt, and living in a manner of graciousness towards one another. Now, in the ancient world, so much of communicating different messages, that was very much in the air. In fact, there's this discipline called rhetoric that was very common in the ancient world. And Aristotle, who's one of the preeminent kind of philosophers during that age, actually would talk about rhetoric in his work, The Art of Rhetoric. Now, in The Art of Rhetoric, so much of the ancient world was around persuasion and argumentation, and in courts being able to adjudicate as well as to argue for one's position in one place or another. Now, Aristotle, he would actually write in The Art of Rhetoric, he would write how there are 3 different key elements to any kind of message of persuasion. And the first area of that he said was very important to this area of, again, how do we communicate and persuade other people? So you could imagine in this culture where rhetoric, where arguing one's position mattered so much, he started to outline what matters most when you begin to share any kind of news that you're trying to share with someone else. And number 1, he talks about this word ethos. Can I hear you say ethos? That's right. Ethos was basically the idea of the messenger, the reliability of the messenger. Now, we get words like ethics from ethos. In other words, ethos was, if I'm someone who's trying to share a certain kind of word, then my character really matters. Like who I am I reliable as someone who's sharing this news? Now, this goes back to this theme. It doesn't matter what I have to share. It doesn't matter how winsome my argument might be. Fundamentally, if I'm someone who's not a reliable witness, then my testimony is completely shot. And so one of the things that Aristotle would say is your character matters. Now, in the same way, this is why Paul and Peter and others are basically saying it really matters who you are and how we show up in the world. So many others around say, I'm so compelled by Christ, but Christians, I don't know. Why is that? Because our ethos has suffered. As a result, the message suffers. Now, it's not only ethos, but it's also pathos. Can I say pathos? That's right. Pathos is actually, we get words like sympathy from pathos. Pathos means feel, like feelings. But what Aristotle is talking about is the mood of the audience, the feeling of the audience. Am I someone whenever I go somewhere, am I someone who's really cognizant of who I'm talking to? So it's not only am I reliable in what I say and the way that I live my life and what I know about, but also in what I share and what I understand about the audience. Now, there's a reason. If you've been around long enough at Hope, you know that I make fun of Staten Island a whole lot. And I always get a laugh out of it because we're in Manhattan. Now, I don't use that joke in Staten Island. Well, maybe sometimes, but nonetheless, right? Well, why? Because, I know that, joking about, there's usually three places, actually. There's Staten Island, there's New Jersey, and Boston. Those are usually the ones that I pick on, I think it's funny. Anyhow, now what do I do? It's because, hey, listen, I'm playing to the audience. But listen, this idea of persuasion and being able to understand the mood of an audience, that's a very key component of any kind of argument that one makes or any kind of persuasion that someone is willing to do. Now, I remember I was in college when my faith really reignited, and I became kind of a know-it-all, and I would study theology and this discipline called apologetics, which is basically trying to argue reasons for faith and giving a reason for what I believe. And so I would memorize all these intellectual arguments, read tons of different tomes on this discipline of Christian apologetics. And I remember moving to New York City in September of 2001, September 5th, 2001. And here I was as this person who had met Jesus in my college years in a significant way. And now I was kind of this brainiac Pharisee who knew a lot about the Bible and wanted to tell everyone what they should believe. And then 9/11 happens. The whole city is upended. My world is like, there's now suffering and difficulty, and people are going through incredible trauma here in the city. And I'm wrestling with how do I communicate faith to a cultural moment where people are in such significant pain and grief. And I remember I was talking to a mentor of mine, and he asked me this question. He said, Drew, how would you respond to someone who asks you or says to you, I can't believe in a good God who would allow suffering and pain to exist in the world? And immediately when he asked that question, I remember just kind of perking up and being like, I was made for that question. Let me tell you. And so in my mind, I start thinking about, well, for suffering and evil to exist, you have to believe there is evil and suffering. That must come from a transcendent source, and that transcendent source must be able to adjudicate between what's right and what's wrong. But that transcendent source, if it wants to have a relationship with us, we must be free. And if we're free agents, then we should be able to, because love can only be free. So I'm like calculating all these different arguments. Theodicy and the problem of evil. The teleological argument for the existence of God. I'm like calculating in my head how I'm going to respond. And Jim, my mentor, he looks at me and he goes, Drew, knowing you, you're already thinking about all these arguments you're about to make about why evil exists in the world and why God would allow it. And I was like, so, and he says to me, but what you would not have known was that the person who said that statement about not believing in a good God who would allow suffering, she actually believed in God until she lost her brother in the Twin Towers on 9/11. And he said to me, you might know all this philosophical jargon and theological arguments, but I'm here to tell you that one of the most important things you can do is just learn to listen to people and hear them and care for them. I remember as this 21-year-old, arrogant Christian trying to learn ministry. I remember being so humbled by that corrective to invite me to actually be able to see and understand people in a better way. In Emotionally Healthy Discipleship, we talk about how Martin Buber, who's a Jewish theologian, he talks about how in today's world, we have this propensity to treat people like it's. And so as a result, with other people, we have an I-it relationship with them. We treat people as if they're it's. Now, some of you, even as you hear that language, you're like, I've experienced that in New York. You've experienced that in your workplace, in the city, on the train, how we treat one another as it's. Now, Buber talks about one of the most significant moments of transformation that can happen for any of us is to move from being I-its, from treating people as it's and being treated as an it, to actually being able to see people and treat them as thous. To have an I-thou relationship with people. Now, one of the reasons why we talk about having relationship skills and growing is because so many of us, again, we've been culturally conditioned to treat people as it's, when the invitation of God is, how can we actually begin to treat people as thous, as if their voices, opinions matter? Even if they might disagree with you, even if they might come from a different disposition, and for the early church, even if they're trying to kill you, how do we treat people as thous? Now, what an incredible invitation to actually care and take the time to listen and respond with kindness to one another instead of operating as I-its, but actually to be a people of I and thou. Now, this is where emotionally healthy discipleship gets at ethos and pathos and the way that we treat one another. And here's an image of what I, thou might look like, the image of sacred space that exists whenever we treat people as thous as opposed to it's, who I can get what I want out of this relationship. And how many of us, the greatest conflicts that we feel in our relationship is because of the ways that we start to treat people like it's and those people over there. Now, Aristotle's Art of Rhetoric, though, it has this third element. It's not only ethos, which is the character and the reliability of the messenger. It's not only pathos, understanding the mood of the audience and understanding the feel of where other people are coming from, but it's also logos. Now, logos, we get words like logic from logos. Logos is this Greek word that means word or account or logic. Now, logos is this word that talks about, yes, there's a reliability of the messenger, and there is the understanding of the audience, but there's also the reasonableness of what I'm saying. The actual thing I'm talking about, does it make sense? Or am I someone who's basically saying something? I might be as reliable as they come. I might be a person of great character. I might be someone who's super caring, but at the end of the day, I think that MJ is the GOAT and not LeBron. And I'm totally wrong. So I'm just kidding. So sorry, some of you guys missed that joke because LeBron's the GOAT. But nonetheless, Jason, am I right? Yes, all right. No, I'm not right. Okay, you got MJ. But nonetheless, the actual message matters. What I am presenting, it's not only my character, it's not only my ability to listen, but it's also the logic or the reasonableness of what I bring up. Now, this idea, so the question then, for a Christian then, if there is this ethos, if there is pathos, look at what Peter writes in the letter. He says, in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. This is what he's saying. He's saying, in your ethos, be someone who's so connected to Christ that you treat Christ as Lord in your ethos. Now, notice, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason, right? There's that word for reason. Be reasonable for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. This is the pathos. Now, do you see how even in Peter's instruction to the church in Asia Minor, he's talking about, listen, what it means to be good news people is that we share the good news in a good way. That how we present ourselves, are we a people of reliability? And are we a people who listen and are tuned to people? And does the message that we share, does it make sense to the world around us? Now, which begs the question then, right? If ethos and pathos, we're talking about how our discipleship pathways are all about how we can begin to learn how to be good news people. Because what you do matters, but who you are matters more. Then what actually is the logos? What is the actual good news? I'm glad you asked. Here's what the Christian good news, this good news story has always been about. It's really found in these three words. The three words are beautiful, disappointing, and hopeful. God created the world to be beautiful. And so that's why, whether you're a Christian or you're not, if you experience beauty and joy and felicity in life in any way, shape, or manner, like yesterday when it was like that teaser of spring that came out at around 10 a.m. yesterday, and you went out in shorts and t-shirts, you know what I'm talking about? You experience beauty. Now, you don't even have to be a Christian to be like, this is what heaven is supposed to feel like right here. But the world is disappointing as well. The world is full of disappointment, brokenness, fear, whether it's nature, culture, humans, human relationships, right? And so when it started to get cold, you went outside in shorts and a t-shirt yesterday morning. And then by about 6 p.m., there was this harsh wind, the wind tunnels that existed on Fifth Avenue. And you were like, this world is disappointing. You know what I'm talking about. There's beauty and there's disappointment in life. But the good news of Christianity is that Jesus has come to bring us hope, is that Jesus has come to show us another way to live, another way of experiencing life. Now, these three words, in many ways, when it comes to whether someone's a Christian or they're not, everyone has experienced beauty and disappointment before. And in fact, it becomes a frame then for how we approach life and how we even describe what we go through. So some of you, you know this experience, right? You start dating someone and it's like, oh, this is beautiful. Then, you know, you see everything through rose-colored glasses. Then after 3 months, you're like, oh, it's beautiful, but it's also disappointing. You know what I'm talking about. And the question is, okay, in the midst of beauty and disappointment, in the vacillating hills and valleys of life, where do we find a hope that can triumph over all these things? But you know this as well. Like maybe you joined a church. Maybe you're like, oh, hope. It's a beautiful congregation. And I really like the pastor. And then you meet me and you're like, it's also a very disappointing congregation. I'm really disappointed by the pastor. Kind of weird. He makes us high five all the time. I mean, but isn't it true that all of life is full of beauty and disappointment? See, but the good news of Jesus is that Jesus has come to be our ultimate hope. Now, this frame, beautiful, disappointing, hopeful, we talk about how there's three different responses. There's gratitude that hopefully, when we experience beauty, we experience gratitude. But also, when we experience disappointment, we actually practice grieving. Grieving looks like confessing and repenting. This is what Christians believe, that we confess, believing that all of us have made mistakes and I need to take responsibility for the ways that I've messed up in the world. Hopefully I'm a person who's constantly apologizing, making amends, wanting to be a person who has a humble disposition. And so confession and repentance is just simply one way. Some of you are like, that's such a religious word. Well, I just want you to know, confession and repentance is simply one way for me as a human being to admit that I am not God, that I make mistakes, that I don't have it all together. But there's also a part of grieving that's about humility and vulnerability and bringing all of our mysterious grief to God because of the disappointments in the world. But lastly, because of the hope that we have in Jesus, we're supposed to be people of grace, people who can not only receive God's grace as a gift from God, but also we're people who hopefully give grace and mercy and justice to the world around us. Now, this is the invitation of the Christian story, and it's meant hopefully to mimic the story of all of us, wherever we come from, whatever background we have, whenever we confront difficulty, pain, and suffering. Now, I realize some of you are like, that title, Beautiful, Disappointing, Hopeful, that sounds kind of familiar. It's because I wrote a book. I wrote this book called Beautiful, Disappointing, Hopeful, How Gratitude, Grief, and Grace Reflect the Christian Story. And I really wrote it for a church that all of us could hopefully realize that the Christian story is a compelling story. that it mimics the experience, the human experience of beauty and disappointment, and what do we do with it? But it also gives us a way of hope that is much different than the world around us. And this hope is found in the person of Jesus. And that hopefully we're people then that practice gratitude in a world that tends to be so ungrateful. Hopefully we're people who practice grief in a world that continues to tell us to ignore your grief or numb the grief with more Netflix, with more social media, with more whatever. And hopefully we're people that experience grace. Now, this book, I want to let you know, it's for sale right outside today. We only have some limited copies. I wanted you to know, listen, the proceeds to this book, if you purchase the book, the proceeds do not go to me, okay? They go to my kids' college fund, all right? So if you want to support my kids, I'm just kidding. It actually doesn't go to my kids' college fund even. It actually goes, all the proceeds will go towards emotionally healthy discipleship, that ministry that I was mentioning, to be able to help and aid churches around the world. So if you purchase it here, and I believe it's the lowest, you'd get it anywhere. And again, this book is a resource. My hope is that you'd want to give this to people who are wondering about Christianity or experiencing beauty and disappointment, or you'd want to read it with someone who's interested in learning more about the Christian faith and why you believe what you believe. This is what I'm talking about when it comes to this idea of logos. What is the message? And one of the beautiful things is that there are so many messages in the world around us about where we can find hope. We can find it in ourselves and self-actualizing our own hope. Or we can find it in others, a great community. But here's the thing, you and I know that oftentimes my whimsical feelings, they fail all the time. I get into ruts and I get into highs, and sometimes I'm fluctuating so much that maybe it's not I can find hope in myself, and maybe it's not finding hope in others, because as you and I know, sometimes our family fails us, sometimes our friendships fail us. What does it look like then to find our truest and deepest hope in a transcendent God, but not only a transcendent God, but a transcendent God of love? Look at what Blaise Pascal writes. Blaise Pascal writes, men despise religion, especially in New York City. That's not what Pascal wrote, but I'm just saying that. Men despise religion. They hate it and are afraid it might be true. Why? Because we think that religion, what it does is it constricts us. It strips us of our own agency. And here's what Pascal says. To cure that, we have to begin by showing that religion is not contrary to reason. There it is. It needs to be reasonable, that it is worthy of veneration and should be given respect, that it's also compelling. Next, it should be made lovable, that it should be true and compelling, should make the good wish it were true, then show that it is indeed true. Now, here's what Pascal is saying. Pascal is saying, like, isn't that true? Like, in general, especially the modern New Yorker, most of us, we want to live for ourselves. We don't want to worship a God. We can trust in ourselves and our own acumen and our bank accounts and our careers and how smart I am. And the invitation, though, is that every single one of us, we experience beauty and it doesn't matter how much money's in your bank account. It doesn't matter what family you come from. Every single one of us experiences beauty and disappointment at various points in our lives. See, but the invitation of God in the Christian story is, will you be able to find a hope that will not fail you, a hope that you can trust in and find to be enduring beyond your own whims, beyond what other people, how they might fail you and how they might help you, that you have a God in heaven. And what Pascal is saying is, what if this God were true? And what if that story was actually the story of a lovable, attractive kind of God? Now, here's the thing about Jesus, because Jesus comes into the world. He comes into the world, and yeah, he doesn't offer military conquest and power, even though he says, I could call down legions right now. He has all the power in the world, and yet he doesn't come and conquer with might and power and military strength and money. He comes and he conquers with love to show you and me that this God is a God who wants to woo you, not with his power, but with his love. Here's what Jesus would say to anyone who would listen. He says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. He gives this invitation to anyone. Are you feeling weary? Are you feeling heavy laden? Feeling this oppressive feeling that there must be more to life than this? Has your burden become heavy? One of the beautiful things about Jesus is he says, you can come and follow me. Now, the story of Christianity is like, hey, come and follow me, and then you'll get healthy and wealthy. Now, I wish I could stand up here and tell you that was the Christian story. It's not. The Christian story is better than that. It's you can follow me, and no matter what happens in your life, you can trust an eternal God that loves you and would die for you. And so when Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, perhaps some of you you've come into this room today and you're like, oh gosh, this Christian thing is supposed to be good news. Honestly, it's felt like bad news to me, or maybe it's felt like no news, and it hasn't even affected your life. And what if it was the grace of God for you today? You've felt some disequilibrium in your own life, in your own journey. You've been struggling with depression, been struggling with this addiction. You've been struggling with this relationship with a parent figure. You've been struggling with your career. You've been wrestling with just kind of life and the meaning and the purpose of life. And what if today was the grace for you that the God of heaven and earth wants to say to you, hey, will you come to me? Are you weary, heavy laden? Are you tired? And do you want to find a rest for your soul? Do you want to find the safest person that you can entrust your life, your hopes, your worries, your fears, your gratitude, your grief? Come to me. Come to me and find what you've always been searching for.